Hi, today we're going to discuss the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune is a brief insurrectionary, anarchist, revolutionary struggle, temporary government that takes place in Paris at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And it's really France's loss in the Franco-Prussian War that provides the vehicle for the Paris Commune to happen. And briefly, the anarchist and socialist forces which take over Paris and establish their own separate central government are able to act on the ideologies that had been growing throughout the 1800s for revolutionary movements such as anarchism and communism. Unfortunately for the communards, as they're called, they're crushed by the first great example of state terror in modern history when the new French government comes in and slaughters somewhere between 15 and 30,000 people at the end of the Paris Commune, and it's called Bloody Week. Now, in the subtitle of your PowerPoint, I give you words idealism. Like for a lot of folks, anarchism represents an ideal type of government. We discussed that somewhat in class, as well as socialism. I would say socialism is less of an ideal, just more the idea that property should be owned communally. Anarchism, again, the ideal. Authoritarianism, you know, in the end you have the authoritarianism of state, the new government of France that comes in and brutally suppresses the Paris Commune and slaughters people for as little as using the word to address somebody in the street, as opposed to the more formal vous, for those of you who have taken some French lessons, as that was considered indicative of the lower class of Paris, who were predominantly the supporters of the Commune. So there's a massive authoritarian slaughter of the revolutionary forces, and on the other hand, at the tail end of the Commune, as the French army, official state army of the French, is coming in and crushing their revolt, the Commune itself creates a new Committee of Public Safety, as we'll talk about, and uses some authoritarian measures of their own. Okay, so next slide here. The prelude to the Paris Commune. And so we want to put this in context, right? What's happening in history at the time. So we've talked already about the revolutions of 1848. Remember, revolutions of 1848, for the most part, are crushed by the conservative forces, and this is idealized in the writings of Metternich, the Concert of Europe, where the conservative countries in Europe unite to come together to crush the independent revolutions that spring up in all these different European countries. And so, with few exceptions, the revolutions of 1848, they're democratic, they're republican, sometimes, you know, in the example of France, they're socialist adventures, are failures. And so as a result of that, as we discussed earlier, you have the beginning of the International Workingmen's Association, which I believe starts in 1868. And so the idea is, if the conservatives are going to unite to crush revolutions, then the revolutionaries should unite to start simultaneous revolutions around the world, as this is going to be the only way to be successful against the conservative reaction. And so the International Workingmen's Association arguably is in its infancy as the Paris Commune begins, but they are active participants, at least in putting forth candidates in the Paris Communes and trying to see that this revolution is successful. So you have the International Workingmen's Association, and these guys are predominantly dominated by the ideas of Bakunin and Marx, representing the anarchist and the communist ideologies respectively. And remember, anarchism, as argued by Bakunin, is most importantly, in my opinion, decentralized, and so you have a system of completely independent, self-governing communes, and commune is just a town or a city, who would democratically decide whether or not to form greater federations with other independent cities around the world, which could eventually unite into a national and international government, but always, as Bakunin says, from the base to the summit. And this is contrasted by Marx's idea that you want to start with a really strong central government and then move the revolution out from there. And in the International Workingmen's Association, you eventually have a split. This happens in 1872. It's after the Commune. But just bear in mind, you have this association of international revolutionaries, many of whom are in Paris. You know, at the beginning of the Paris Commune, you have thousands of political refugees from other countries who have actually come to Paris to work as, you know, in one way or another, sort of professional revolutionaries, espousing their ideas and trying to unite the workers of the world, if you will. Okay. Also, shortly before the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III, who, remember, comes out as sort of the authoritarian conservative emperor of France, has made some concessions to the more liberal forces in his country. He legalizes strikes and he legalizes political meetings. And so in the years up to the Paris Commune, you have lots more open agitation and political action by different groups such as anarchists and socialists, which allows them to network and gain power. And so they're really arguably ready to sort of, you know, sprout up and blossom with the opportunity that comes with the Franco-Prussian War. And the Franco-Prussian War begins in 1870, right? And remember, the Franco-Prussian War is a result, arguably, of Napoleon III being duped or tricked by the machinations of Otto von Bismarck into declaring war on Prussia. And this is part of a wider plan by Otto von Bismarck to create a united Germany out of all those separate German states. Remember, the quest for a united Germany failed when it was attempted to be done under the auspices of liberalism and democracy in the Frankfurt Assembly. Otto von Bismarck successfully unites Germany using, as he calls it, blood and iron. And his last stage in uniting Germany is the Franco-Prussian War, which Napoleon III and the French lose. And so, how this factors into the Paris Commune is, and this is on September 1st and September 2nd, you have the Battle of Sedan, or the Battle of Sedan, if you want to say it in the French way. And I apologize to my international audience for the mispronunciations I'm about to make in a lot of these names. So, in the Battle of Sedan, the French army, led by Napoleon III and by MacMahon, and MacMahon's eventually going to be the military leader that goes in, crushes the Paris Commune, brutally suppresses, massacres 15,000 to 30,000 people. Napoleon III and MacMahon, they lose the Battle of Sedan. They lose, 80 to 100,000 troops by losing. They're not actually killed. Let me qualify that. 80 to 100,000 troops surrender to the Prussians. Napoleon III surrenders to the Prussians. And at this point, the French people, and particularly led by the folks in Paris, they want to continue fighting the war. The Prussians, in advancing their terms for peace, have stated that they will stop fighting when France agrees to cede Alsace and Lorraine to the Prussians. Alsace and Lorraine are, besides Paris, the most heavily industrialized portions of France, so the wealthiest, the most productive as far as manufactured goods. There's a large German-speaking population in those two states, which is, arguably why Bismarck says they should belong to Germany. But this would be sort of a horrible slap in the face to the French nationalism. So the French want to keep fighting to keep Alsace and Lorraine, and the Prussians have also stipulated there's going to be a huge indemnity paid by the French if the Prussians are going to agree to a peace treaty. So, September 2nd, Emperor Napoleon is captured. September 4th, Paris workers take over the Bourbon Palace and force the Legislative Assembly, which is part of the government of France, to proclaim the fall of the empire, to essentially say that the French government under Napoleon III is gone, is dead. And then these protesters, these insurrectionists, declare a third republic, right? And also declare a provisional government of national defense that's created simply to continue the war and hopefully win it against Prussia. Okay, does this make sense? So you have one French government that falls. This is the empire of Napoleon III. It's gone, right? A third republic is declared in Paris. The third republic immediately sends out representatives to try to organize the provinces of France to try to mount a defense against the Prussians. Eventually, this Third Republican provisional government is going to send emissaries around Europe into Britain to try to get allies for the French to fight against the Prussians, but nobody wants to help the French fight against the Prussians because it's pretty obvious that they're going to lose. And not only that, but Bismarck has already gone around, as we've talked about before, to the countries around France and either made promises to them or at least got their guarantee of neutrality in this war. So France isn't going to get any help, but this Third Republic is going to keep up this fight against the Prussians for a while longer. On September 19th, you have two German armies begin a siege of Paris. So essentially, Paris becomes the strongest holdout in France against the Prussians. There's other armies in other places which eventually surrender. Paris holds out the longest, I believe, for 4 months. Paris is hit by between 300 and 600 shells per day. That's artillery shells. Temperatures get to be around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The Seine River freezes over for like 15 days. It's a really bad situation for this provisional government in Paris. Bismarck, jokingly quips that the Parisians will only last as long as their cafe au lait. As soon as they run out of coffee, they're going to quit. He underestimates certainly the resolve of the French to fight the Prussians. So the French fight on for 4 months. At one point, they hold a meeting to try to come up with new ideas on how to defeat the Prussians. And one is to arm their prostitutes. There's, perhaps 25,000 prostitutes in Paris, and they're armed. The idea is to arm them with poison needles. They'll seek employment from the Prussian soldiers, and they'll kill all the officers. Another one is to play Wagner music, which the French believe the Germans are almost hypnotically fascinated by. Play Wagner music at the head of a Trojan horse filled with machine guns, and as the Germans let the band playing Wagner into their camp, Trojan horse will open up and mow all the Germans down. Neither of these plans obviously come to fruition, but nonetheless the French hold out for just as long as they can. On January 28th, Paris is surrendered to the Prussians by the provisional government, and this is, at this point, Paris, the Parisians, there's like 2 million Parisians in the city. It's surrounded, it's bombarded. They're starving to death, particularly children and old folks are starving to death. They've eaten all the animals in the zoo besides the tigers, which they were afraid of. The tigers starved to death. The elites of France, they're eating, for example, because they're elites, carcass of cat surrounded by carcass of rats, so the presentation represents their high status, but nonetheless they're eating cats and rats. So they're really in a bad way. France surrenders Paris. The regular army of France has to lay down their arms, but the Prussians allow the National Guardsmen within Paris to keep their weapons. And this is going to be pivotal in the formation of the Paris Commune. So the citizen army of Paris is allowed to remain armed while the regular army fighting in Paris is disarmed. All right? Now, the new leader of the new National Assembly, which is voted in, elections are held on February 8th, 1871, voted in on February 12th. Its new leader is Adolphe Thiers. And Adolphe Thiers believes that the National Guard in Paris should maintain their guns because they will maintain the stability of Paris. Now, it's a massively wrong calculation on the part of Thiers, because the National Guard essentially joins with the revolutionaries who are going to come, and they form the backbone of the army of the ill-fated Paris Commune. Okay, so you have Paris is destroyed. People are starving. The National Guard is armed. Okay? German troops enter the city. They're only allowed to occupy a small section of Paris. Now, even before the new National Assembly is elected and Paris is surrendered, you have the first attempted insurrection against the provisional government in Paris by anarcho-communist socialist revolutionaries. And these are led by Auguste Blanqui. And Blanqui, we will talk about him in class, but he's one of the most famous revolutionaries during this period. And Blanqui can be seen as what you could call, what I've heard called proto-Leninist, right? And so Blanqui is the most highly organized revolutionary in Paris, and probably the most popular revolutionary in Paris. And so when he hears that the provisional government is simply entering in negotiations with the Prussians, he and his men attempt to storm the hotel where the provisional government is stationed. And as a result of this, and there's some shots ring out and his folks have to give up. As a result of this, Blanqui and some of the leaders of his movement are arrested, and Blanqui is actually taken out of Paris, right? But the thing to remember is, even before new elections are scheduled, and even before Adolphe Thiers takes over the French government, you have groups of anarcho-socialists in Paris trying to take down the provisional government and establish an independent commune. Initially, just to fight the Prussians, right? Just to continue the fight against the Prussians, eventually to break off and form a separate government. And the Blanquists will become perhaps the most potent force in the Paris Commune, but sadly for them, their leader, Auguste Blanqui, is in prison. And they try to negotiate the Paris Commune. They try to negotiate his release by offering to give up an archbishop and really all the prisoners that they hold. But the new government of France, located at Versailles, realizes what an important prisoner they have in Blanqui and how charismatic a leader is, so under no circumstances are they going to let him go. All right? So, you have an insurrection that's put down. Blanqui is arrested. Adolphe Thiers takes over a new French government. The new French government realizes that the National Guard in Paris, which is armed, needs to be disarmed. And he doesn't want to go around and take all their rifles one at a time. Really what Thiers wants to take from the National Guard in Paris are their cannons, right? Their artillery pieces, sort of the backbone of the land army at this point. And Thiers sends in a regiment of troops under the leadership of General, and this is General Lecomte, into Paris to take away the cannons. And this is really where the fighting begins. The civil war begins between the new French government and the Paris Commune, right? So the regular army comes in to take the cannons. And the cannons, the most important ones are located on Montmartre. So some regular army troops, led by General Lecomte, go to Montmartre to seize these cannons. They're quickly surrounded by groups of angry Parisians who don't want the cannons to go. One of the soldiers fires, regular army soldiers of France, fires into the crowd, kills a National Guardsman. At this point, Georges Clemenceau, future leader of France, and who during the Paris Commune is an intermediary between the Commune in Paris and the French government, who eventually flees to Versailles. The folks in Versailles thinks he's too radical. The folks in the Commune thinks he's too conservative. Clemenceau thinks he's surrounded by crazy people who won't compromise. So, a Parisian is shot by the French army. Clemenceau takes folks from the army, takes General Lecomte, before they're going to be massacred by this crowd, takes them away and tries to negotiate a peace where the army at Versailles can get the cannons and nobody else is going to die. Unfortunately for Clemenceau and Lecomte, They are eventually taken by the National Guardsmen, and interestingly enough, the National Guardsmen and the Parisians convinced several of Lecomte's own men to quit his army, to join the insurrectionists in Paris. And Lecomte and another general, a general by the name of Clement Thomas, who was in Paris at the time, who had been in Paris for the siege, but was so hated by his soldiers for his strict disciplinary practices as the Prussians were laying siege, General Clement Thomas is also seized as he tries to flee Paris in disguise. He's seized by the Parisians, by the National Guardsmen, and both him and General Lecomte are taken out, put up against a wall, and shot. And Clement Thomas, I believe, had been shot 40 times, right? They dig 40 musket balls out of his back, and Lecomte, I think, is shot 6 times. So you have 1 dead Parisian, you have 2 dead generals. Shortly after this, the National Guard takes over Paris. The National Guard goes to the hotel where they believe the Thiers government is located. They're mistaken. Thiers is actually located at another building. They go to try to find him. They can't find him. Thiers and members of this new French government flee Paris, go to Versailles, set up a government there, and you have the beginning of essentially a civil war, right? On March 26, 1871, and this is the cannons, the attempted take of the cannons from Paris is on March 18th. On March 26th, the Paris Commune is elected, right? And so you sort of have 2 groups in charge of Paris. You have the Paris Commune, and then under the authority of the Paris Commune is the National Guard. The National Guard organizes the election of the Paris Commune. So you have a power sharing happening here. And I think most people would argue the National Guard holds real power because they're the ones who are armed. But the National Guard also consists of all able-bodied men in Paris. So really, one could make the argument that you have very close to idyllic democratic rule in Paris, as idyllic as you can get without the participation of women. So really, you have the beginning of an anarchist commune elected in Paris, which is going to take over the governing of the city and going to attempt to fight against the regular French government, which has been recently formed and has relocated to Versailles and is bent on taking Paris back. So, these elections on March 26th, they're dominated by anarcho-communists, anarcho-socialists, and some of the most popular folks are Proudhonists, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, he's another anarchist philosopher we're going to be talking about. Their most dominant leader is a guy named Eugene Varlin. He is a candidate that's put out by the International Working Men's Association, the International Comintern, as we've called it also. He becomes the Commissioner of Finance. He becomes the point person for labor relations with the Commune. Interestingly, Varlin is one of the most ardent opposers of the eventual establishment of a committee of public safety by the Commune as the soldiers from the French government in Versailles are moving into Paris. So he's against authoritarian rule by the Commune, remains a Democrat until his death. He tries to save hostages who are being shot by the communards as the army of France comes in. In the end, as the communards lose to the French army, the regular French army, Varlin is tortured, blinded, and shot, along with 15 to 30,000 other people. You have the Blanquists, as I've talked about before, very predominant in the Paris Commune in this elected council. Sadly for them, their leader is not there. He's in jail. He's elected president of the Commune in absentium. He's not there, but he's still the president, and the Commune continues to try to negotiate unsuccessfully for his release. And then you have many which are called independent revolutionaries. So they don't declare themselves followers of Proudhon or of Blanqui or of any other of the anarchist parties. They're independent. Delescluze becomes famous. He's eventually the chief executive of the Paris Commune. He takes charge of the military in the final days of the battle against the French army, even though he has no military experience. As he becomes sure that the Paris Commune is going to lose and the French army is moving through the streets, he climbs to the top of the nearest barricade, puts on a sash that's indicative of the chief executive of the Paris Commune. He has no guns, he climbs up, presents himself to the French army, and he is quickly shot dead. So, you have this elected council, elected by the people of Paris, elected who essentially, all able-bodied men in Paris are members of this National Guard. So they take over the government of Paris, and you have this first anarchist commune taking control of a major city in Europe. So what do besides die at the end of all this? So the reforms that they attempt to establish, and these are all laws that they pass, they officially become the laws of Paris, they just don't survive because all these guys are put down in brutal repression. You have separation of church and state. So this ends any payment of the French government to help out churches and ends any association of the French government with any particular church. They end military conscription. There's no draft. They end the regular army. There's no army. They create the citizens' army, or underline the National Guard that already exists. And these are, you notice I have a picture of Bakunin up here. These are the ideas of Mikhail Bakunin, right? You get rid of the army, you arm all the citizens, and then they can protect they can protect your independent commune. They also immediately begin pursuing potential relationships with other communes that they're trying to establish in other cities around France. Mikhail Bakunin, he's up here. A year before the Paris Commune, he tried to create an independent commune in an insurrection in Lyons, France, which quickly fails as the army comes in. He just says he gives up and essentially flees, and he's not around, sadly for him, probably to take part in this commune, but a lot of his ideas are embedded in the folks that run the commune. The remission of rents during the siege by the Prussians. And so essentially, all the workers in Paris, most of them are rent, right? Most of them during the siege can't work, so they can't pay rent. And essentially, as the landlords come back into Paris at the end of the war, they want to start collecting all the debts that the workers owe them, who in no way the workers can pay, so essentially the workers will be made homeless. So one of the first things the commune does is says, you don't owe any money to the landlords during the time that Paris was under siege, right? They abolished night work for bakers, right? And this was a famous complaint of the bakers of Paris. They had to work extremely long hours at night. They couldn't be around their families. They're really considered an oppressed folks by the owners of the bakery. So no more night work. Pawn shops had to return workmen's tools up to a value of 20 francs that had been pawned during the siege. And so one of the immediate problems that Paris has is the folks who perform the work in Paris have pawned their tools, right? And so a pawn shop, if you don't know what a pawn shop does, if you're desperate for money, you take something valuable to a pawn shop. The pawn shop loans you money in exchange for using that item as collateral. The pawn shop keeps the item as collateral until you can pay back, or a certain amount of time runs out, and then the pawn shop sells your items. Well, the problems the pawn shops were creating, besides being seen as a group of people who exploited workers, which in the eyes of anarchists and the eyes of communists is bad, the problems they were creating was you had a bunch of workers out there who had no tools. And so they couldn't perform masonry work or carpentry work or plumbing work because they had no tools. So the commune says to all the pawn shops, you got to give back the tools, and that's another picture you see up here with the pawn shops opening up the boxes, handing out the tools, and the workers can go back and start trading again, start industry again in Paris. They give pensions for unmarried companions of guardsmen and children. And this is another idea that we talked about from Mikhail Bakunin. Like Mikhail Bakunin wants to get rid of all state marriages, right? And so essentially what this law says is if your husband or your dad is in the National Guard and you're not married, you still get pension if he dies. Okay? And this was a right that previously had been reserved to only those who had been married to members of the National Guard when they died. So now, National Guardsman dies, his girlfriend can collect his money, and his kids, his illegitimate kids, can collect his money. So they postpone all commercial debt. So they postpone the debt that folks owe on businesses, and they abolish all interest on debts. So if you've taken out a business loan, not only can you wait to pay it off until the end of hostilities, hopefully in the eyes of these folks until the ultimate victory of the communards, but you don't have to pay any interest on that debt. You know, interest is again seen as a form of oppression on the upper class, on the lower class. The right of employees to take over industries with absent employers, whilst providing the employers with compensation. So this is another one of the tenets we talked about from Bakunin's philosophy, right? Essentially, if you wanted to own a business, you had to show up and work. If you weren't going to show up and work, the business became the property of the workers. And so the commune makes this law. But interestingly, they're not going to go so far as to take the business without compensation. They say the employees take over the business, but the employees have to compensate, have to pay the business owner for the business that's been taken over. And then finally, the prohibition of employers fining workmen. So not only could employers at this point not pay workmen if they didn't do work, but they could actually fine them for not showing up or not working hard enough. So employers could actually take money away from their working people and working folks who end up in debt to their employers. The commune abolishes this. So here, like in this set of laws, that we see, you can see the actual establishment, albeit brief, of the ideal anarchist commune as seen by Bakunin and as seen by a lot of the other followers of similar ideologies. Proudhon is a good example. The Blanquists really didn't develop a formalized ideology about what would happen after they took over, but much of what Blanqui would said should be done property-wise and citizens' rights-wise would also line up with what these folks said. Right? You also see a picture behind me of Louis Michel. Louis Michel is representative of the participation of women, active participation of women in the Paris Commune. While they didn't hold office, they did open up a lot of schools to teach revolutionary ideology. They did operate a lot of industries, and Louis Michel in particular and a few other women engaged in active hostilities with the French army, actually led groups of fighting soldiers against the French military. Louis Michel is one of the folks who is part of the failed invasion of Versailles by the communards. And we'll learn a lot more about Louis Michel as we move on. Louis Michel, the Red Virgin of Montmartre. She has a really rough life, but is really seen as a sort of an ideal example of an anarchist revolutionary. Okay, so these you could see as the successes of the Paris Commune, right? They successfully overthrow, cause to flee the regular government of France. They have to leave Paris. They successfully hold elections that are representative, arguably, of the majority of folks in Paris. And the majority is kind of a strong word here. They certainly win the majority of votes, but something to keep in mind is the upper classes in Paris largely abstain from the voting for the Paris Commune. They realize that this new government is not going to represent the interests of the bourgeoisie, of the upper class, and at the urging of the new government of France located in Versailles, they abstain from these elections. And you have a council that was originally should have been 92 folks based on the number of representatives for the population of Paris, and eventually you have 60. So, a third of the population either does not vote, does not participate, or their representatives refuse to take part in the elections. Questions? Okay. So the war in the Bloody Week So the first thing that you see back here is the failed invasion of Versailles on April 2nd. So the Paris Commune realizes that it needs to take down the government of Versailles in order to establish themselves in perpetuity as an independent government. The government of Versailles wants to take them down. The government of Versailles has actually negotiated at this point with the Prussians to release the hundreds of thousands of prisoners the Prussians have, so that the new government of France can win the civil war against the Paris Commune. The ideals of the Paris Commune are not only against the ideals of the elites in the new French government represented by Adolphe Thiers, but also against the conservative ideals of Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I. So Prussians are going to help the government of Paris take back the Paris Commune, the Prussians are going to help out the government of France take back the Paris Commune. And so the Paris Commune realizes that it has to strike at Versailles if it wants to be victorious. Now the real problem with the invasion of Versailles by the National Guard of the Paris Commune is the National Guardsmen of the Paris Commune, they don't believe that the French soldiers will actually fire on them. They believe that the French soldiers in their hearts are going to be supporters of the Commune, because the Commune is representative of the average people in France, which, arguably it really is, and the French soldiers are representative of the average people in France, right? Now, a long campaign of propaganda, going back to before the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, has turned the majority of the French countryside against the Parisians. Like, majority of your rural folks in France are conservative. They espouse a real hatred for anarcho and socialist ideas of the working people of Paris. So this is going to be a huge miscalculation for the National Guardsmen and the Commune. They try to invade Versailles without artillery. They don't even bring enough food. They don't bring enough extra ammunition. They think they're going to walk up to the gates, fire a few shots, and the regular French army is going to surrender. This is probably the greatest example of idealism causing failure of an anarcho-socialist revolution. So the National Guardsmen approached the Palace of Versailles. The troops at the Palace of Versailles unleashed several volleys of artillery fire, started to decimate the communards, who didn't expect to be fired on really at all, and so the communards retreat. And 20 days after this, you have the commencement of the Bloody Week on April 21st. During the failed Versailles offensive, or failed invasion of Versailles, you have the summary execution of communard prisoners captured by the regular French army. The regular French army captures communard prisoners, then they kill them pretty much on the spot. In retaliation for this, the communards create a policy of an eye for an eye. So the Paris Commune, and this is against the objections of Eugene Varlin and his followers, they have a policy of revenge. So if the regular French army kills a communard soldier, then the communards kill a hostage, somebody that they've captured who they believe is sympathetic with the regular French government. And a lot of these folks are religious, like a lot of priests, a lot of bishops end up killed by the Paris Commune as a result of this eye for an eye policy. As Bloody Week commences, and as the regular French army starts fighting their way into Paris, once again against the vociferous objections of Eugene Varlin and many other people, the Paris Commune rather narrowly votes to establish a Committee of Public Safety. And they model the Committee of Public Safety on the Committee of Public Safety during the original French Revolution that creates the terror. And they want to, sadly, in my opinion, use many of the same tactics. So they seek out anybody who may be against the Commune, and summary arrests and interrogations and executions ensue. And so you have street to street fighting, barricade to barricade fighting, right? We haven't talked a lot about barricades, but these are popularized during the French Revolution. Essentially, you dig up stones, and you turn over carriages, you take any kind of debris, and you build a wall across streets, and you fight from behind that wall. Napoleon III tried to limit barricades as he rebuilds France in his reign by making really, really broad boulevards, right? With iron balconies above the boulevards where people can shoot down at potential insurrectionists. Nonetheless, the communards are fairly successful at building barricades. Unfortunately, the organization of their army is not nearly tight enough. The army is not nearly well trained enough, nor do they have enough men. Eventually, they are overpowered by numbers and training from the government in Versailles, and they're slaughtered. And as the army takes over one street at a time of Paris, they just begin summary executions. And this is really the first example of state terrorism in the modern age. And one of the things to understand about state terrorism is oftentimes when you read newspapers or watch news or you hear people talk about terrorism, particularly in the West, we think primarily of Islamic terrorism, and these are non-state organizations killing people to try to take down national governments. For folks in my generation, when we heard terrorism, particularly in America anyway, the first people that came to our mind were the Irish Republican armies, who would, run around and blow things up. And seemingly, in my memory, they blew all kinds of stuff up and, could never manage to really kill anybody. But terrorism, at any rate, what I'm trying to get across is terrorism for most of us is associated with non-state actors, with unofficial groups using terror tactics, fear, right, to try to take down national governments, or particularly in America's case, to try to get America to withdraw troops and change their policy towards the Middle East. What you really want to understand about terrorism is the biggest terrorists in modern history are always the state governments. Terror tactics are just simply tactics that are used to terrorize populations into submission. Okay? And terror tactics, think Stalinist Russia, think Nazi Germany, massive summary executions of anybody associated with the opposition to strike terror in the hearts of the opposition and to support the state. Another example, which a lot of folks would argue with me on about state terrorism, is look at the Israeli response to folks in the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip launches a bunch of essentially armed model rockets, right? They launch 100 of them, one of them gets through, nobody dies, right? Or, Hamas, they sneak somebody into Israel, runs up to them with a knife, stabs them, right? It's terrorism, of course, it's terrorism, no argument there. But the state terroristic response is to send in the F-16s, the Apache helicopters, with an overwhelming, terrorizing use of force to get the population to submit to the rule of the state, right? So just keep that in mind. And really, the first instance of modern state terror is the French government and its repression of the communards. So they go through Paris. If you have ash on your face, they kill you like chimney sweeps, right? Because they assume that you've been firing a gun. If you have a bruise on your shoulder, right, you're a terrorist, right? Because you've been shooting a gun, right? If you use, and I said this before, to greet somebody, you're a terrorist, because that is the nomenclature of the working poor, as opposed to vous, which is the more proper upper class way to greet somebody. You're killed. Men, women, children, executed. 15 to 30,000 people are executed during this bloody week, and the terror is crushed. And this is going to inform both sides of revolutions and warfare to come, right? One of the reasons that Lenin becomes a supporter of state terror is because he watches it happen in Bloody Week. He watches the state use it to crush the rebellion. And he learns two things. One, that the state will stop at nothing to crush a rebellion. Two, terrorism works, okay? Which which leads him to institute purges. Okay, so what's the legacy of the Paris Commune? The Paris Commune hangs over the heads of Europeans like a cloud, really all the way to World War II. Changes the tactics of revolutionaries. In my opinion, it reinforces the more radical ideas of revolutionaries, right? Like two I have back here, Vladimir Lenin and Sergei Nechayev. Sergei Nechayev is the most radical of the Russian anarchists. We're going to read his revolutionary catechism. His ideas are essentially the revolutionary. Becoming a revolutionary must immediately renounce all friendships, all family members, all acquaintances, and must be willing to do anything to kill, namely, and to die for the revolution. Stop at nothing for the revolution. He says the revolutionary is a doomed man. He has nothing. Lie, cheat, steal, kill, whatever you have to do for the revolution. Vladimir Lenin, who is going to, on the one hand, be a proponent of state terror. On the other hand, he's going to follow in the footsteps of Louis Blanqui, who says that if you want a successful revolution, you do not want to unite all of the proletariat, right? A la Karl Marx. You do not want to unite all of the peasants, all of the social revolutionaries in the Russian Revolution. What you want is a small, disciplined, fighting force to take down the central government and spread the revolution from there. And he's successful, right? He learns this from the ideology of Louis Blanc, who, if he was present for the Paris Commune, maybe things would have gone differently. The ideas of Mikhail Bakunin remain popularized, but in the Second International, he's going to lose political power to Karl Marx, although arguably his ideas still remain more popular among more people. Just the Marxist and eventually the Leninist ideas are going to become more popular with those who win. Anarchism spreads around the world. Folks like Emma Goldman in America promote anarchist ideals, and you have a massive uptick in anarchist assassinations around the world. There's like 100, elites, heads of state, leaders of government who are assassinated by anarchists of the deed, as opposed to anarchists of the word who just promote the ideology, don't want to kill people. Anarchists of the deed who just run around killing people, throwing bombs in cafes, robbing banks, stealing money. President McKinley is killed by an anarchist of the deed, etc., etc., etc. All of these things hark back to the failed ideals of the Paris Commune and desires to make them successful, and the responses to the successful use of state terror by the French government during the Paris Commune. I would like to thank specifically John Merriman, professor at Yale, for a lot of the information from this presentation, particularly his ideas about state terror, and Auguste Blanqui and his position as a proto-Leninist are all from John Merriman. So thanks, I hope this was informative, and we'll see you in class. The commune itself creates a new committee of public safety, as we'll talk about, and uses some authoritarian measures of their own. Okay, so next slide here. The prelude to the Paris Commune. And so we want to put this in context, right? What's happening in history at the time. So we've talked already about the revolutions of 1848. Remember, revolutions of 1848, for the most part, are crushed by the conservative forces, and this is idealized in the writings of Metternich, the Concert of Europe, where the conservative countries in Europe unite to come together to crush the independent revolutions that spring up in all these different European countries. And so with few exceptions, the revolutions of 1848, they're democratic, they're republican, sometimes, in the example of France, they're socialist adventures, are failures. And so as a result of that, as we discussed earlier, you have the beginning of the International Working Men's Association, which I believe starts in 1868. Hi, today we're going to discuss the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune is a brief insurrectionary, anarchist, revolutionary struggle, temporary government that takes place in Paris at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And it's really France's loss in the Franco-Prussian War that provides the vehicle for the Paris Commune to happen. And briefly, the anarchist and socialist forces which take over Paris and establish their own separate central government are able to act on the ideologies that had been growing throughout the 1800s for revolutionary movements such as anarchism and communism. Unfortunately for the communards, as they're called, they're crushed by the first great example of state terror in modern history when the new French government comes in and slaughters somewhere between 15 and 30,000 people at the end of the Paris Commune, and it's called Bloody Week. Now, in the subtitle of your PowerPoint, I give you words idealism. Like for a lot of folks, anarchism represents an ideal type of government. We discussed that somewhat in class, as well as socialism. I would say socialism is less of an ideal, just more the idea that property should be owned communally. Anarchism, again, the ideal. Authoritarianism, you know, in the end you have the authoritarianism of the state, the new government of France that comes in and brutally suppresses the Paris Commune and slaughters people for as little as using the word to address somebody in the street, as opposed to the more formal vous, for those of you who have taken some French lessons, as that was considered indicative of the lower class of Paris, who were predominantly the supporters of the Commune. So there's a massive authoritarian slaughter of the revolutionary forces, and on the other hand, at the tail end of the Commune, as the French army, official state army of the French, is coming in and crushing their revolt, democratically decide whether or not to form greater federations with other independent cities around the world, which could eventually unite into a national and international government, but always, as Bakunin says, from the base to the summit. And this is contrasted by Marx's idea that you want to start with a really strong central government and then move the revolution out from there. And in the International Workingmen's Association, you eventually have a split. This happens in 1872. It's after the Commune. But just bear in mind, you have this association of international revolutionaries, many of whom are in Paris. You know, at the beginning of the Paris Commune, you have thousands of political refugees from other countries who have actually come to Paris to work as, you know, in one way or another, sort of professional revolutionaries, espousing their ideas and trying to unite the workers of the world, if you will. Okay. Also, shortly before the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III, who remember, and so the idea is, if the conservatives are going to unite to crush revolutions, then the revolutionaries should unite to start simultaneous revolutions around the world, as this is going to be the only way to be successful against the conservative reaction. And so the International Workingmen's Association arguably is in its infancy as the Paris Commune begins, but they are active participants, at least in putting forth candidates in the Paris Communes and trying to see that this revolution is successful. So you have the International Workingmen's Association, and these guys are predominantly dominated by the ideas of Bakunin and Marx, representing the anarchist and the communist ideologies, respectively. And remember, anarchism, as argued by Bakunin, is most importantly, in my opinion, decentralized, and so you have a system of completely independent, self-governing communes, and commune is just a town or a city, who would democratically